Okay, I think we're going to start. And people can just come in and hop on. A moment. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. We are in for a very informative and inspirational evening with our guest speaker, Dr. Shari Rogers, our three panelists, Tamara Lanier, David Bernstein, and Bruce Turnbull, and our moderator, Sharon Portnoff. To help us get started, I will give a brief intro of each of our speakers, and then I will turn the evening over to our moderator, Sharon Portnoff. First, the director of the film that brought us all here tonight, Dr. Shari Rogers. Dr. Rogers is a licensed clinical psychologist and social activist whose work encompasses movie production, writing, educational programming, curriculum development, and public speaking. She's the executive producer of the PBS documentary, Eli Inspiring Future Generations, examining the impact of Holocaust survivor Eliezer Ayalon, a Yad Vashem tour guide from Israel, and his inspiration to make positive change in the world. Shari is the president and founder of Spill the Honey, a Michigan-based 501c3 organization committed to promoting human dignity, as well as public knowledge, Holocaust, and the civil rights movement. Now for our panel. We'll start with Tamara Lanier. She is a 27-year veteran of the state of Connecticut Judicial Branch, retiring in 2017 as a chief probation officer in the Norwich Probation Office. In May of 2015, Tamara was named Woman of the Year by the Connecticut General Assembly's Commission on Afro-American Affairs. In November of 2016, Tamara received the Connecticut Commission of Human Rights and Opportunities Leaders and Legends Award and the 2019 Inspirational Women's Award. David Bernstein is president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. David previously served as a consultant dedicated to assisting organizations and communities in strengthening their Israel education, engagement, and advocacy work. He is also founder of Cultural Solutions LLC, which works with nonprofits on strategic planning and culture change efforts. David spent 13 years at the American Jewish Committee, first as director of the Washington Regional Office, and then overseeing regional offices and national and local programming and advocacy. Bruce Turnbull co-chairs the Criminal Justice Initiative of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. He is secretary of the board of directors of the Jews United for Justice Campaign Fund and is a member of the Lawyers Committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Bruce previously served as vice president of the board of directors for the Washington Regional Office of the American Jewish Committee and co-taught a course on Jews and the Civil Rights Movement at the Jewish Community Center of Northern Virginia. And last but certainly not least, our moderator, Sharon Portnoff, is the Elie Wiesel Associate Professor of Judaic Studies and Associate Professor and Chair of the Classics, Arabic, and Jewish Studies Department at Connecticut College. She holds degrees from St. John's College in Annapolis, Harvard University, and the Jewish Theological Seminary. Sharon is the author of numerous books and articles since 2007. In 2016, she served as a scholar in residence at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy at St. Antony's College in Oxford. I thank you all so much for being here and participating in this evening. It's going to be wonderful. And with that, I will turn this evening over to our moderator, Sharon Portnoff. Sharon?
Thank you very much, Marcia.
You're very welcome.
I want to thank everybody for being here, and I am really very honored to be serving as the moderator for what promises to be a very compelling conversation. I want to also acknowledge Marcia in particular and the Federation in general for all their efforts to bring this film to us and to make this panel possible. So I want to begin, first of all, thank you so much, especially to Dr. Shari Rogers for being here and taking the time to speak with us. And of course, for making the film Shared Legacies, which is a powerful reenactment of the special bond between Jews and Blacks in the US from the turn of the last century through the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Towards the end, the film begins to point to the fraying of that bond. And so overall, the film's historical perspective lays out very clearly the similarities between Jewish and Black experiences in order to serve as a foundation for a renewed alliance. It's really a call to action. And I'm very grateful for the passion that Dr. Rogers brought to making this film. I want to start by speaking, give Dr. Rogers the floor to let her speak a little bit. But at the same time, I want audience members to feel free, if you have a question, to send it via chat. And I will do my best to, to sort of do both things and try to get to the questions to bring them up and also follow the conversation. I have people helping me, so hopefully it won't get too convoluted. Okay, so I want to obviously to begin with Dr. Rogers, and then we'll bring in the rest of the panel. So Shari, can you tell us a little bit about the film and the making of the film? What motivated you to make it? How did this film come to be in your life?
Sure. Thank you again. And thank you, Marcia, for organizing. And I'm just so humbled to be a part of this esteemed panel. When I looked up all the panelists, it's like I'm just very, very honored that you all, watched our film and that you're going to take the time to discuss it. I'm very appreciative. And that's the one good thing about COVID. It allows us to meet all these wonderful people all over the world, basically, and have important, courageous conversations. And that's what I guess I'm most pleased about the film right now, is that it's being used as sort of a platform to have these important discussions and bringing communities together state by state. So in order to either recommit the relationships that are already involved or to inspire new ones. So I'm happy about that. But in terms of your question, thank you for asking. First of all, my sister, I was a Reformed Jewish woman, and I never even studied the Torah. I had a bat mitzvah, but I didn't really understand how the Torah was a book to help character development. And it wasn't until my sister became Orthodox, and now she lives in Israel, that I actually began to, want to learn more about her. So I studied in Esha Torah, and I started learning. And from that, I ended up on a Mosaic mission, a Federation mission to Israel, and with 40 women. And I met a tour guide at Yad Vashem. His name was Eli Ayalon, and basically was so moved by his story. His mother's last gift to him before he would have to leave her and survive 5 concentration camps was a jar of honey, and she said it was beshert that he should survive. And they were an Orthodox family, and he begged not to go, but she said, "You will have a sweet life." And so the story really touched me, and from that it took me like 2 years, and we finally raised money and did a film about his life. It was originally going to be a Jewish story, and what happened was, when we were filming him in Poland, he said there was a Christian man from Boston who came on an alma mater mission and was inspired like you were, and he's creating a foundation because of my story as well, and I want you to meet him. And anyway, so it was that's how it started. And then I'm from Detroit, and I went to the museum. They have a wonderful museum in Detroit, the Charles Wright Museum, and there was a professor there, Dr. Clarence B. Jones. And he was a professor at Stanford University. He was Dr. King's personal attorney from 1961 to 1968, his legal advisor, and his draft speech writer, including the I Have a Dream speech. So he had written a book called What Would Martin Say? And one of the chapters was on anti-Semitism. And as a Jewish woman and as an activist studying Judaism in more depth, I was struck by his fierce energy to make sure that everybody in the audience knew about the Jewish people and their 24/7 commitment of the Jewish people to the struggle of the civil rights movement. So we developed a friendship, and I don't want to go on and take too much time, but quickly, President Obama was president at the time, and he was being honored. Clarence was being honored at the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts. And fast forward, it was the 50th anniversary from the Selma and Montgomery March. And so that was the time that we figured we would start filming. The movie Selma had just come out, and we thought this would be an amazing time to start filming the living witnesses to this coalition.
Wonderful. While you're speaking, one of the things that struck me in the film is very interesting was your inclusion of Orthodox rabbis, right? You don't often hear about their involvement in the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Well, Rabbi Berman, he's a professor actually on ethics at Columbia. And what was interesting is he actually had some contrition because he said it took the 50th anniversary from the Selma to Montgomery March for him to really reflect on his own experience in Selma and how he was in jail and all the experiences. And he said he never really taught about it to his students or whatever. So from like me filming him and from the whole Selma experience, he started teaching about his own activism and how it was directly connected to Torah and Rabbi Heschel, and how many people think social justice is disconnected from Torah, and he was brilliantly explained the connection. And I'm probably not, versed enough to explain it like he can, but he would be a wonderful guest at another time because his stories are absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah. So the movie was incredibly powerful. The historical approach that you took, sort of spelling out how this relationship developed really from very early on through the civil rights movement. And then it sort of stops a little bit with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And sort of skips over to 2015. So I found that omission to be very telling and very interesting. I can ask sort of a direct question about it, or I could sort of leave it at that and have you fill in the pieces. But I guess where I'm going is, can you say something about maybe what's happened between the Blacks and Jews, like in this alliance that sort of caused it to fray a little bit, or?
Well, Heather Booth talked about it a little bit in terms of she felt that there was a 30-year hiatus, and many people thought that when the leadership that was speaking to each of their communities about the other community wasn't as activated, that had something very strong to do with it. But then there were so many other things. There was the Jewish community focused more of its attention on Israel. That was after the '67 war. And the Black Power movement, while in many ways, as Dollinger talks about, how it also inspired the women's movement and Jewish activism for Soviet Jews. There was Jews who were kicked out of the movement. So there was a combination of that going on. And then there was Jewish teachers who were very much a part of the teaching experience. And then when Blacks wanted their students, when Black families wanted their students to have the models of teachers look like them, there was that issue in terms of affirmative action. So there was a lot of struggle there that then created sort of, not the heightened connection. However, at the same time, politically, Jews have always been, and that never waned as much in terms of that connection and that support, whether it was, for mayors and those specific things. But yeah. But I would say AJC, American Jewish Committee, and Sherry Frank and Congressman Lewis in the early 80s reconstituted this Black Jewish coalition, and they really thought it was important to rebuild this alliance in terms of the activation that it was in the 60s.
Thank you. I just want to ask one more question. I don't want to be dominating you, though I could talk to you forever. But one more thing I am very interested in is how do you see Jewish activism? How can Jews act for social justice for Blacks in a way that respects the recognition by the Black leadership of their need to control their own destiny? So how do Jews go about doing that respectfully?
Well, I think that Black Jews are really at the forefront of this conversation. And I think we have so much to learn from people like Avila McCoy and other Jews of color. I think they have a lot to teach us. But I'm from Michigan, like I said to you before, and Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, before John Lewis passed away, created a Black Jewish caucus where they're going to be coming out with legislation that we can support. And I think there's, just like in the 60s, there's so much legislation on systemic racism and prison reform and different ways that we can, lend lend our time and our voice and really, listen, I think, and be more proximate. That's the key.
Yeah. Okay, well, I want to bring in the panel now and invite them. First of all, if any of them in particular have a question you want to ask Shari right now, we could do that. Or I can just sort of ask generally to our panel members, what was your reaction to the film? But before you speak, right, because Marcia had to keep the introductions very, very short. And I know that our panelists are highly esteemed in their work, and we would like to learn a little bit about their work. So if you can just very briefly, just in a few sentences, sort of fill out who you are and what you do before you sort of respond either to the film or engage with Shari directly. Bruce, should we start with you, or only because I see you right on the screen? So.
Okay, that's fine. Yes, I am a lawyer in the Washington, D.C. area, and I've become active in the criminal justice reform area, particularly with Jewish Council for Public Affairs, along with David. And one of the things that we've done is try to activate and motivate local Jewish communities through the Jewish Community Relations Councils largely and the Jewish Federations to get involved at the local level, particularly focused on criminal justice reform, but more generally about, and more recently about policing reform. And JCPA's we put together materials. I am JCPA's representative on in Washington on various coalitions on federal legislation. And so there's a lot going on and a lot that, and Sherry, as you say, a lot that can be done. And I think it's really important to make this point and then maybe pivot back to we can go on to the others. And I think it's really important if Jews are going to get involved in a Black Jewish alliance of some sort, that we need to be present for the issues that the Black community believes are the issues of the day. And while the relationships are important, it's also very important for Jews to take our lead from our African-American colleagues and friends on issues, but be present and be willing to do as the civil rights pioneers did in the 50s and 60s and earlier. As the film points out, people went to jail. People put their bodies out onto the streets, and whether you want to do that literally today or not, but be a presence on the issues. So that's my 2 cents. And I'll come back. I've got a couple questions about the film, but I'll let others speak.
Okay, David, would you like to?
Sure. Thank you. It's an honor to be with you. I'm David Bernstein. I'm president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. I've been engaged in Black Jewish relations for the better part of my career. I also worked at the American Jewish Washington director and was very deeply involved in several Black Jewish initiatives, and have brought that emphasis to the JCPA as well. And since I got to the JCPA 5 years ago, we've really been engaged in the way that Bruce was describing criminal justice reform. And that really came out of the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, in the sense that the Jewish-Black relationship might be at a crisis point, and that Jonah Pesner spoke about this in the film, that the movement for Black Lives had just came out with a platform that was very negative toward Israel. That's perhaps an understatement. And we really had this keen sense that we needed to bridge some of the gaps, and that there was a younger generation of African-American leaders who we didn't really know that much. We didn't know well. And we knew all the people in the film, in the early parts of the film. We knew those folks. I mean, I knew a lot of those African-American leaders, and I knew virtually all the Black leaders, Jewish leaders. And yet it was almost like you poured salt in a wound when you went through that grand pivot, and you sort of fast forwarded to where we are now. And the meeting that Jonah Pesner talked about which was with some Jews of color and Black Lives Matter members. I was at that meeting in New York, and it was the first time I had heard some of the terminology that was coming out of sort of the modern civil rights movement. Jews had always thought of white supremacists as guys walking around with white hoods on. And for the first time, I understood that many Black leaders today viewed white supremacy as the fundamental system that defined American society and the domination of whites over Blacks. And that had become the sort of the paradigm of the civil rights movement of the day. And and so one of the things I'm fascinated by are both the similarities and the differences between the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the civil rights movement of today. I think that there are some striking similarities and some striking differences. It's worth trying to understand that so we know how to better navigate it. And I think, Shari, you did a great job of sort of teeing up those issues for us in a way that allows us to have those discussions with Black leaders. A mentor of mine, Murray Friedman, he was the director of the American Jewish Community in Philadelphia and deeply involved in the civil rights movement in Philadelphia. He's since died probably about 10 years ago. He wrote a book called What Went Wrong, and covered some of the territory that I think was not in the film. And one of the things that he liked to say was, it was probably never as good back then as we'd like to think, and it's probably not as bad as we fear today. And I think that's probably true. Yet we have a lot of work to do. There's no question about it. And I'm happy to go into that as we go along. But I'm really grateful that the film was made, because it gives us another way to have that conversation, to think about how we can join together and how the Jewish community can really be there for the Black community today and really make a difference. We don't, one last point, so often when I talk to Jews about the civil rights movement, they talk longingly about, Abraham Joshua Heschel and about Goodman and Schwerner and about our role in it. And I think that's great, yet it doesn't get us off the hook of being involved today. And I think that we have a lot of work to do in the mainstream Jewish community to make sure that we're providing the vehicles and that we're educating our own community to be there in its own voice. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And Tammy, I don't see you, but there you are.
Yes. Well, there's a lot to unpack here with the film. I watched the film. It was really an emotional experience for me because it reminded me so much of the oral history that my ancestors and my elders have shared with me, particularly my mother, who grew up in Montgomery, Alabama. And I know that there was someone at some point who commented in the film that they thought that Georgia was the cradle of the civil rights movement. I grew up hearing my mom say that Montgomery, Alabama was the cradle of the civil rights movement. And I agree with that in the sense that the origin story starts with Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott, which is a bus boycott that my uncle, my mother's brother, participated in. So there were a lot of very, very emotional ties to the film that I had, and my own personal experience and the experience of my family. And also very unique to my circumstances is where we are today as a family and the journey that we've been on. It kind of mirrors the journey of the film. I have been blessed with the opportunity to meet with people like John Conyers of Detroit, the Dean of the House, and John Lewis from Atlanta, as well as Harry Belafonte. I actually visited his house with Congressman John Lewis. And I did that in response to a campaign that I've been on now for about 10 years. One of the things, my mother was a retired teacher, and one of the things that she would share with me is our family legacy, our family story that started with an African-born slave, and his name was Renty. And she wanted me to put a genealogical tree together. when she became ill, it was very, very important to her that I do this. And she constantly reminded me of what she wanted me to do. After her passing, I started working on that project, and I found my enslaved ancestor that she talked so fondly about at the Peabody Museum in Harvard University, which
Wow.
began a 10-year struggle because it's about cultural appropriation and control of a family narrative and denial of history, denial of dignity. And it's a very complicated story. But what it points to in regards to this film is we have shared experiences as Black and descendants of the Holocaust victims and descendants of slavery, but we don't have the same shared legacy. And I say that because when I look at my journey to not only defend the historical legacy of the man that my mom talked about, but just as a Black woman, what we have inherited has been generational suffering and generational marginalization. And I say that to say that in addition to that, there's yet to be a sincere or genuine atonement or acknowledgement of that suffering. So that is painful in itself. And what compounds the issue for me is there's not a willingness to acknowledge that or to talk about it. And you can't heal if you don't know the extent of the harm, if you don't address the harm. So as a person of color, as a Black woman in the United States, I think I can say, and I don't pretend to speak for the Black race, but I can safely say that the issues of race in this country will never move forward until we go back and address the harm of the past. And so that has been my journey. That has been my 10-year journey with Harvard, because I'm saying to Harvard, and I have as my profile picture on social media, a picture of the Sankofa bird, which basically means I can't move forward until I go back and reclaim the history and my past. And what the film does for me, it points out strategically how people have engaged in not only campaigns of civil rights, but campaigns in general, particularly marginalized people who need to seek the voice and the power and the prestige of others to elevate their campaign. And so when I listen to that, that is what I'm reminded of, is the fact that you have people who feel powerless, who feel voiceless, who need to involve or include other groups in order to elevate their voice. And so certainly this is something that we have gotten away from. And was apparent in the film is the history and the fact that how we continue to repeat history and never really learn from it. I look at the civil rights movement of the 1860s. I look at the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and I look at where we are today. And I remember thinking when I was listening to the film that we're kind of 60 years ahead of where we should be if we're going to have every 100 years a major civil rights movement. But we are at a place where hate is, there's a saying that, we can't give hate a safe haven. Hate has a safe haven. And what affects one group directly, well, affects all of us indirectly, is something Martin Luther King said. But to sit back and to accept where we are today, which is hurtful for me, because when I look at this election and I see how close it was, hate was on the ballot. It really was. And I was very, very nervous about the outcome of this election, because I'm correcting people now when they say to me, this is not who we are. Yes, it is. And we have to do something about it. We have to stop ignoring what's going on. We have to come together as all marginalized groups and all groups that have been affected by hate to say that we are trending in the wrong direction. And if we don't do something immediately to change it, we're going to be experiencing another major civil rights movement in the very near future.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That's very powerful. I want to remind everybody in the audience that if you have a question, to please say it on chat. And I also want to ask the rest of the panel members if they wanted to, or if, first of all, let me invite Shari to respond to everybody if she'd like to first before I do anything else. Was there anything you wanted to respond to, or?
Well, I think, first of all, I just want to say that was a very moving, personal story that you just talked about. So I'm so grateful for it. And what I've learned is that for Black Americans, they're still feeling it with every fiber of this systemic racism. But at the same time, I feel that there's also an opportunity that after the murder of George Floyd, the whole world is now focused on racism and really putting their laser focused attention on it, and that at the pain of what the Black community is still going through, it also can be an opportunity to build coalitional partners to figure out how we can best move forward, because I think without communicating and really putting laser attention on it, you know, I think there can be positive out of the pain. And I think, you know, the Jewish community, you know, understands the importance of history and reliving it, you know, year to year, not just to talk about the history lesson, but to talk about how we constantly can, you know, we need to constantly be vigilant about racism today. And I know that the lynching museum that was just built, and even the new African American Museum, the heads of it would learn from, went to Israel, went to other museums and the Jewish museums to really study the museums because of the importance of honoring Black history in a way that there can be pride and empowerment from it. The last thing I'll say is Rabbi Dresner, who was one of the rabbis in the film, told me a story that Martin Luther King had told him, that he said that he wished the Black community could be similar to the Jewish community in terms of looking at the slavery as an empowerment story, not as a victim story. And that a week after Dr. King was murdered, he was supposed to have dinner at the Heschel home for Passover. And we can only imagine what that evening would have been like, you know. So that is in no way to minimize in any way the continued pain of the Black community and how it needs to be centered. And I guess what I'm saying is now is the time to center it in a much more laser focused way. And I hope we can all be as supportive as we need to be.
Okay, we have a question for, I think, primarily Tammy, but I think we can open it to anyone. And the question from the audience is, what is the next practical step to having white people acknowledge and apologize? And I think the emphasis of the question was practical step.
To acknowledge the impact of slavery and apologize. I think the first thing to do is to genuinely apologize. Congressman John Conyers, and I can't remember how many years he worked on this bill, it's HR 40. And I want to say at least for 25 or 30 years, every year, he would submit a bill to the House. And what he was asking is that the bill commission a group to study the impact of slavery on people of color generationally. Also to look at how legislatively Congress can move to address the issues of systemic racism. And basically it was called HR 40 for 40 Acres and a Mule. But that bill has been dead on arrival. And all he's asking for is a bill to commission a group to study slavery and to study the impact. And every year he submitted the bill, every year it's dead on arrival because the country isn't willing, or at least lawmakers at that point have not been willing to engage in that kind of discussion. And what's hurtful for me is, and I talk about this in relationship to my story because I compare myself to a woman by the name of Maria Altman, who was an Austrian-born woman who fled to the United States because of the Holocaust. And when she arrived here, she later learned that an image of her aunt had been hailed as the Mona Lisa of Austria, and the Austrian government had retained possession of that and would not return it to her. And she fought the Austrian government with no success, but her case was heard here at the United States Supreme Court. But at any rate, I say all of this to say, out of that struggle came legislation. Firstly, in I think it was in 2012, or no, I think it was actually in the late 90s. There was a conference that was held in Washington where the United States hosted governments from all over the world to come and look at how the government can protect the cultural property of the Holocaust. And out of this comes the Historical Holocaust Museum. But there were several, I think there was something like 16 recommendations that at some point later, I think it was in 2016 or so, President Obama signed into law the recommendations of this conference. And I said, that's a wonderful thing because they brought the United States government brought the world together to sit down and hash out how they can repair the harm caused by the Holocaust. And I said, where is that same humanity for the descendants of slaves and repairing the harm caused by slavery? So firstly, I think the first practical step is to get our government on board and get our government to look at what they've done in the past for other aggrieved groups and recognize that we're all really in the same boat. We've all suffered terrible atrocities, and to take measures and safeguards to ensure that it doesn't happen again and ignore the plight of another.
Right.
In my mind, you know, it's.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have a number of questions from the audience, but due to technology, they haven't been sent to me. So I'm putting it over to Karen, who's going to ask on their behalf. On the audience.
Great, thanks, Sharon. So we have a question to Sherry or anyone on the panel. Do you think that we should have something like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Committee for America's Systemic Racism? That's for Sherry or anybody else on the panel.
That's been my campaign, Truth and Reconciliation.
I mean, I think that something like that, I mean, the Holocaust, Tammy was just talking about the bill to establish what amounts to a reparations commission or to study that. I think that combined with the sort of South Africa model would be a good idea. I think that the museum, somebody mentioned the memorial in Montgomery. There's also a museum in Montgomery which demonstrates the linkage from slavery to the post-Civil War era, where the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery except if people were incarcerated. And so what they did was incarcerate, make more and more things illegal so you could incarcerate Black people so that you could use their labor as prisoners. And then you got to Jim Crow, and then you got to and theoretically we got rid of all the de jure segregation laws in the 60s, and so then we moved on to in the war on drugs and other kinds of things that incarcerated more and more African Americans. And so this is not just something that there was slavery that was 150 years ago. There has been the whole progression of things and government policies that have maintained that cycle, and we need to address all of that.
I've just asked if you have questions, you can now send them to the room in its entirety, send them to everyone and not privately. But we do have another question, Sharon, for the entire panel. I think the similarity between Jews and Blacks is one of marginalization from mainstream society, but the Blacks suffer from another dimension which Jews have not for the most part. And that is a sense of superiority whites have in their treatment of Blacks. That is because of the caste system. What can we do about that? How does one change that?
I guess I'll start here. So, I'm not sure I would characterize it precisely the same words, but I think it's fair to say that the Black experience with racism in this country is very different than the Jewish experience with anti-Semitism. They're both forms of hatred and bigotry and oppression, but that doesn't mean that they function the same way in society. And I don't think it's in our best interest to describe them in the same way. They really aren't. But I think that there's a role for the Jewish community to help alleviate racism, and maybe it's a special role like it was in the civil rights movement. I don't think we should kid ourselves and say it's the exact same movement and we're going to play the same role. I mean, I think one of the things that the film did that was so effective is explain that the community's changed in those periods of time, right? The Black community now wanted to lead its own movement. And one of the things that whenever we try to get a local Jewish community relations council involved in criminal justice reform or police reform or what have you, we always remind them that these need to be Black-led movements. We're not looking to create that same dynamic of the 60s that led to some resentment, especially in the latter stages of the civil rights movement. So I think we have a role to play, and it's not one where we're setting the agenda for the movement, but we're there. We're present in these movements. As Sherry said, we're proximate to the Black community in these times, and we're looking to educate the white community about some of these challenges. I'm not sure people fully understand how screwed up our criminal justice system is and the scourge of mass incarceration. I'm not sure they understand how these drug laws have been used and how they've wreaked havoc in Black communities. And I think we have a role in first of all, understanding it ourselves fully, and then helping our fellow citizens understand what's really happening, what they don't know because they're so far away from it. So if we get closer to it and we build bridges and we get more knowledge of ourselves, we can play that role more effectively.
Can I turn this on Sharon, because when I read your bio, I was just so humbled. I think you have something, you're so knowledgeable, and I think you have something besides being a moderator. I think I would love to, just as a director of this film, I'd like you to, just say something with your background and in terms of your expertise in Jewish studies and the Holocaust and so much. I would love to hear from you as well.
Well, that's very kind of you to ask. So I do have to preface it by saying, I have not done this kind of work. So it's really not my field. I was very grateful, though, for the movie pointed me to that religion and race lecture that Heschel gave that I'd never read before. And I found it, by the way, on a site called blackpast.org. So that was very lovely. But I guess the thing that I'm mostly thinking about is the foundation of the film that created the alliance, from what I understood, was religion and history. And I'm not sure how well they can serve as a foundation for a future alliance. So to make it like more right. So one is, we had Tammy saying before, she talked about the denial of history. I mean, I think that's sort of what, I don't mean to put words in her mouth, but what I understood her as saying is that the history, Black history, has really been erased in a way, and so I'm not sure what laying out of even this wonderful supportive history and calling Jews to action, how that actually contributes. So that's sort of something I'm a little confused about. Contributes to the alliance. I saw Bruce sort of looking. Obviously it's a wonderful contribution to call us to action, but I lost the other piece of it. Oh, so to bring it down to life. So Shari, you said, and I'm really just asking out of asking because I don't know, that if we could understand the Exodus, if we can somehow inform Black experience with the Exodus as a source of hope or power, or there's a big difference between Jews and the Exodus as a narrative that we remember, right? We have an obligation to remember, and the lived experience of every day having your history erased and being in the world. So those are just random thoughts that I sort of am struggling with trying to understand. And that's sort of why I asked this question about really how Jews can contribute in a way that doesn't silence anybody, that really doesn't take center stage, that doesn't put our categories of experience, that doesn't overlay it to the Black categories of experience. And I know that David and you and other people have started to say things about it, but that's sort of where I am trying to think about.
I guess what comes to my mind is at the end of the movie, or when I was interviewing Congressman John Lewis, it was interesting. He had said, we are all living in fear. And if Martin Luther King were alive today, I have to believe that he would be pulling together with Rabbi Joshua Heschel for those generations yet unborn. So I think people forget that Congressman Lewis, as amazing as he was as a civil rights activist, as a congressman, was also studied the Bible. He was a reverend. And I think to go back and study the spiritual connections and what brought Rabbi Heschel to say when he first met Dr. King, it was easier for the Israelites to cross the Red Sea than it is for Negroes to cross a college campus. And then I think of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, his blessed memory, who just passed away, I think it is today, and wrote very much about Dr. King and the Exodus. I just think it's the Jewish narrative that is so important, this slavery and attending to people and justice. And I think there's a point of connection that we shouldn't rule out, that can be a support and revitalize that connection, that can be very helpful as we're moving in terms of doing what JCPR and all these criminal justice and all these terrible injustices that continue today. But I think to get at the soul of it and to remind ourselves of who our souls are about and what our narrative, I think, can be an important adjunct to helping us motivate as we move forward.
That in particular is what I love the most about the film, is that it really, from what I understood, it doesn't seek to resolve, like, this is how we get along, ideologically, religiously, historically. It really just sort of grounds it in act, right? That justice you shall pursue. I guess that was on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's chamber wall. So. Yeah.
Sharon, can I add something here?
Please.
One of the things that, if I could leave anything with this audience, it's a Jewish audience, is not to make this work of Black-Jewish relations harder than it is. I have to tell you, as someone who does this work on an ongoing basis, I feel like the most challenging aspect of it is navigating the Jewish community. There are voices in our community who want to make it challenging for us to be at the table. They want to say, well, there's an anti-Semite or somebody who knew an anti-Semite, And if you're at that table, then you're therefore legitimizing anti-Semitism. I was in a conversation with a prominent Jewish conservative journalist who believed that the Jewish community should cut ties with the national NAACP because the Philadelphia NAACP director had made some very nasty anti-Semitic remarks. And we were honestly losing patience with the NAACP as they were going through their process. And these are our friends, and we didn't get a statement. They had their own arcane processes to go through and about making a statement, not to make a statement. And he said, you should just cut off ties and send them a strong message. At the end of the day, not only did the national NAACP speak out, but they actually closed down the entire chapter of the Philadelphia NAACP. This was just in the last few weeks. And I emailed that same Jewish journalist and I said, how do you like that? Again, engagement works over time. It just doesn't always work when in the moment, but engagement works over time and allowing us to be at the table, sometimes in challenging settings, and encouraging us, not just allowing us, encouraging us to be at those tables and not making it harder than it needs to be because we're so pure in our idea of who we can sit with and who we can't sit with. I think would be a huge step forward with our own community and would make it a lot easier for us to do this work.
Thank you. It's very inspirational. Thank you.
Could I chime in on that as well, which is that I think, and this is related to something David said earlier when in quoting somebody else, that back in the 60s, it wasn't always as good as we like to think it was. And Sherry, this was a question I had about the film. There were references in a couple of places to Jewish communities in the towns where the civil rights actions were happening, who were saying to the northern Jews who were coming down, hey, we have to live here. You're making it hard for us. It's not safe. And I think that there was a moderate amount of that. It was one or two references, and I don't know whether, Sherry, what you found in your research on this as to how prevalent that was. Obviously, the temple in Atlanta is not in that category, but other communities, I think, were.
Thank you for the question. I couldn't get into everything, but even Rabbi Heschel wasn't so beloved by the Jewish community in many ways because of his over-involvement. There was many people who said, you should be paying more attention to Israel right now. It's not really the place you should be. I mean, so there wasn't this uniformity of Jewish people that were completely, standing with the Black community then. However, there was enough of the white community at that time. There was enough of a Jewish involvement on so many different levels that it was worth telling this story and worth vitalizing and remembering and making sure we have, as Clarence said, the lions to tell this story. But it's not just these people. If you go from state to state, we were in Chicago last week, and Rabbi Funay was talking about in Chicago how his rabbi, and he's a Jew, a Black Jew, and how his rabbi inspired him to learn from Rabbi Heschel. And every single state has stories, whether it's rabbis or attorneys or Jewish activists that weren't necessarily religious that were involved, judges that helped with the Selma movement. So this is another whole area of, I think, of importance to look at the historical coalition of partnerships and to show that we were different then as well, and that we might have differences, just like, David points out now, but that it's the building of partnerships and relationships, Sherry Frank being like a soul sister to Congressman John Lewis, and how and Rabbi Berg right now, who's so close to Reverend Warnock, and how they're working on white supremacy legislation and how they stand with each other. And I think we can't rule out being proximate and building these bridges and finding commonality that we can work on. So, while there were many Southern, rabbis at the time and people who owned stores that were, yelling so much, like, what are you doing here? You're making our lives miserable, leave. There was Jewish people who were fighting, saying, no, during the Holocaust, there was silence. We're not going to leave, and there was a part that I didn't include in the film where there was at one time there was Black leaders in Selma who said, this is our movement, and you're also making our life difficult here. And so Rabbi Berman talks about it, and he said, you convene and decide. It's one thing when it was the Jewish people who were saying to me for us to leave, but if you feel that we should leave, we will leave. And the Black community convened, and they voted for the rabbis and for the Jewish people to stay. And I almost put that in the film, which I think is so important. But they stayed. They wouldn't have left if it was the Jewish people saying leave, but it was the Black community that decided that they should stay.
Interesting. Thank you.
So I've been asked to remind everybody in the audience, all questions are welcome. Please, just post them on the chat. We did get a question.
I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you.
It was such a pleasure to talk. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the film.
How late it is. It's such a great
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Sherry.
you.
Sharon, I do have one question that came in. America has to realize that a debt is owed to the enslaved African to address the income wealth gap. The foundational African American fought in every war protecting this nation, and even when they built their communities, they were destroyed. The Black soldiers returning from World War I were attached, as were the Blacks returning from World War II. The bottom line is the Black experience is economics. Immigrants who arrived to America and white women who benefited from the Civil Rights Bill more than Black people. Is there going to be any progress in addressing the foundational Black Americans? Policies written specifically for Black people who built this nation, not minorities, people of color, policies specifically for Black people. And that's for the whole panel.
Yeah, I think either Bruce or David want to take that.
I mean that goes back to the issue of reparations and the HR 40 that Tammy was talking about. That the question of how to address that. There's no question that the wealth gap, and actually today, if you look at today's wealth gap, it is as large or larger than it was in 1970. So we have not made so much progress on that front. But the wealth gap exists in large part because of government policies. I mean, redlining was an official policy of the federal government. And that is why far fewer Blacks were able to buy houses, and we're not able to buy in neighborhoods where the wealth was accumulated. And for many white people, a lot of their wealth is tied up in what they were able to accumulate as a result of buying their housing. And that specific one. And so there needs to be an addressing of that whole set of policies for years and years and years, not just slavery, but not that long ago, and even till today.
And that's why truth and reconciliation is so important, because the true story of the history of this country has never been told. I am, well, I won't tell you how old I am. I'm pretty old, but I am just learning the history of this country and the extent of slavery and the extent of governmental policies that were rooted in racism and designed to oppress people of color. And so when we talk about HR 40, which is a commission to expose, and not only expose, but to look at all of, when we talk about from slavery to Black codes, to chain gangs, to sharecropping, to Jim Crow, to mass incarceration, to the new Jim Crow where we are today, some people have a belief that when slavery ended, it was like a switch that was turned off. And we can talk about policies from the 1850s to where we are today that systematically target people of color and deny them, that disenfranchises them, and And that is why it's important to have these discussions in this commission to sit and look at the impact of all of these things historically on people and where we are today.
You know, I'll add something here. You know, it's a very challenging environment. You know, and I know we just got through elections, and I watched this film over the weekend, and I was very emotional from the election. So I was probably more emotional watching the film than I might have been normally. You know, and I'm mindful that we have a segment of our society that you know, that probably is still very racist in the same way that maybe our parents' generation and grandparents' generation might have been, and feels resentful. And some of these people, they're not doing too well themselves. And you know, I struggle with how, you know, Tammy, you said this about, well, you know, there's a percentage of our population that a high percentage of our population that supported the president. And what does that mean? What does that mean for us that they were willing to do that? And you know, and so the question is, yes. And then what do we do about that? How do we make sure that we have a conversation about inequality that doesn't further exacerbate tensions and becomes a way for them to be included once again in the American story? I mean, if you look at how much, you know, the manufacturing sector and its disruption in this country affected both Blacks and whites in blue collar cities, you realize how that probably played a huge role in the racial dynamics today. And I just feel like there's a conversation that we have to create in this country that allows people to talk and brings them into that conversation so that some of those resentments are ameliorated. And I'm just really thinking out loud. That's not a talking point. It's not something I've written about. I'm just struggling with this myself as we think about this in this post-election period and what it means moving forward for our country.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if you looked at the reaction to the police brutality and the killing of George Floyd and the others, Breonna Taylor and others, there was a visceral reaction in the same way that there was in the 1960s when Bull Connor's hoses and dogs were shown on the nightly news, and I think that there is you know, as horrible as that may sound, I think there is an opportunity to bring that back to the American people, even people who voted for Donald Trump had some measure of that reaction. I think the public opinion polls that have been taken that have talked about what should be done with policing in the United States support going to those people and say, okay, you voted for, you know, we're not going to argue about your vote for Donald Trump, but let's talk about what kinds of reforms make sense in the policing in America. And that, you know, use of force, oversight, you know, holding them accountable, changing some of the standards for that sort of thing. I think there would be support for that from a broad cross section of the American public, even those who voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I think you're generous.
Tammy's skeptical.
And one thing that I didn't mention is for 27 years, I was a chief probation officer. I worked in the criminal justice field for 27 plus years. I also, for 20 plus years, 25 years or so, was the criminal justice chair for the Connecticut State Conference of NAACP branches. And I am currently the vice president of the New London, Connecticut branch. But I share that all to say that, you know, I have, you know, not only lived experiences, but what I've witnessed and what I've come to realize is people who don't share those same lived experiences can't wrap their head around the kinds of brutality, the kinds of mistreatment, the kind of misconduct that people of color have been complaining about for years. If that is not their reality, they have a whole different concept of the criminal justice system and a whole different relationship with the police. And so for me, what troubles me is, up until George Floyd, and there have been other cases that garnered a national outcry and national empathy, but that was short-lived. And my fear is that the momentum that we got from George Floyd is waning, and before long that he will just be one of many names of the past that were victims of police brutality. But I say this with all sincerity. I believe that there's a section of the people that just are not reachable, that are just not willing to embrace cultural differences. And I believe that there's a section of the people who, because of their lack of cultural competency or exposure to other people other than themselves, just don't know, but have a desire to want to know and to want to learn more about the Black experience or the racism that people of color feel. But, again, there is a section of people that I think that we are just going to say, you can't tread on other people's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the government has policies and laws in place that they need to enforce to protect people of color. That is, historically something that has rarely happened. But for those who have a genuine interest in wanting to know and wanting to be more informed and wanting to be a part of the healing, I just encourage training and more exposure to people other than, their own particular culture. And I know that there is a large number of people that are just, I say culturally deficient, but just have had no other experience with people outside of their own ethnicity. And so, and I do believe that there is a section of people who recognize that and are willing to do more to be more culturally competent. But then there's a section of people who just don't care. And, and that is where the government has to step in and say, you don't have the right to tread on anybody else's constitutional rights.
Right.
And hold them accountable.
Of course, I agree with that. And I think, obviously that's why we have a Bill of Rights, and that's why we have civil rights laws, because we know that there's certain people who are not going to be able to help themselves, and they're going to engage in horrific acts, and they're going to engage in hate crimes and the like. We talked about a film today. There was a film made by Dia Khan, who's about the Charlottesville, and she embedded herself with some of the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. And the funny thing is that she was so endearing to them that several of them actually left the movement because she humanized a person of color in a way that they had never been exposed. Literally, their life experience was such that they'd never been exposed to anybody like her in their entire lives. And I'm not saying that that's scalable, like that we're not going to be able to do that everywhere, but we can probably do what you're saying and expose more people. I mean, I think, my most formative events about race are, sitting there and talking to an African-American friend about his own experience with the police. And I don't think there's anything that I've read about or in a newspaper or heard about on a forum that was nearly as impactful as that. Is that just sort of personal conversation? So I think the more opportunities we provide for people to actually talk to each other about their experiences, and the more we can take off some of that ideological edge of this conversation, I think the more we can bring people along. And that's not going to be everybody, but I hope over time, incrementally, we can bring more people along.
What I mentioned this essay that I read today that Heschel wrote, and he gives 6 things that sort of get in our way. He says racism is Satanism. He says straight out. And the sixth one he says, and I'm quoting, is we can dedicate our minds to issues of a far more sublime nature, right? That's one of the major problems in in overcoming racism. It was very beautiful, I thought, the way he put it. So is anybody else interested in coming up questions?
Yeah, there was a question from Carla Bender, I believe.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss it? Let's see.
Carla, unmute and ask the question. Makes
Okay.
it easier.
Okay, there are two parts to it. The first quick part is this film going to be shown on public TV or anything like that? Anybody know?
Shared Legacies. I'm not sure, but I believe it's going to be, I mean, it was open in February of 2020 at the Atlanta Film Festival. So
Okay.
I believe it is going to be more public, but it was in March that we went into COVID. So that kind of stopped everything. So, but I can check with Sherry about what's happening with it going forward.
Can I say something? Marcia? It's Arlene.
Yes, go ahead, Arlene.
That film is not going to be public anytime soon. That is one of their hottest films of the year. It's making its debut around the country in various film festivals. And if you're waiting for that to be on Netflix or YouTube, I think you're going to wait quite a while.
Well, my daughter went to see it in Pennsylvania, so I was just wondering if it was going to be there somewhere. Okay, the other part of my question is, I found the movie very moving, very, very interesting. About a year and a half ago, I heard Dr. Zola speaking in Texas. He's one of the people who was interviewed for this talk.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought up Farrakhan and said that he writes a lot and he disseminates a lot of information. And it's presented in a way that many people think it is serious scholarly research. And he disseminates a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism that way. And Zola said that even some of his colleagues thought that some of this information was true about Jews. And it's not true. And I wanted the director to comment on that if she had a comment. I don't know if anyone else on the panel can comment.
Farrakhan is a challenge in Black-Jewish relations today. There's
You're muted, David.
Okay, there we go. I think I'm back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it that Farrakhan is a challenge in Black-Jewish relations today. Jews, our way of fighting bigotry is to condemn it wherever it rears its ugly head and try to push it to the margins of society. And here we have a Black leader who's criticized. John Lewis, by the way, would not go to the Million Man March. So there are certainly Black leaders that refuse to abide by Farrakhan's anti-Semitism, but many have, and many have said, listen, I know he's an anti-Semite, and yet he's so important for Black empowerment, and they're willing to put up with that, and that's painful for the Jewish community. I think we should not in any way cover that up. That's an ongoing painful dimension that in the relationship with the Black community. I recently dealt with some of the issues around Al Sharpton. Al Sharpton in the early 1990s was very involved in sort of stirring resentment in Crown Heights, which is where there was a whole series of killings and so forth. I don't need to go into it so much. Al Sharpton partially apologized for it. I saw the video where he did that. A lot of people don't think he went nearly far enough and so forth. Al Sharpton is a major leader in the civil rights movement. He led the recent March on Washington. So again, these are challenges in Black-Jewish relations that can make it challenging for us to get to that next level.
And if I can add on that, I think it's in the approach. I know that I had a conversation once. I tried to, I'm not all knowledgeable about cultures and I have my own cultural incompetencies, but there's no ill will. And I remember I had a conversation with a young lady about, there was a discussion about it being anti-Semitic, I can't speak now, to talk about Jews and wealth. And so we had this whole conversation. I said, help me understand that, because, and I think, the education that needs to take place in order to understand the cultural differences, people have to feel comfortable in that space to have that conversation and have that learning, have that education, so that they can walk away being informed. But, I don't want to, I felt almost a little bit attacked when we had this conversation, and to be, completely candid, I was the most respectful that I could be, but I wanted to understand where that was coming from in the historic context or whatever. And I don't feel, and actually there were two people there, and I got more from the second person. I got completely defensiveness and hostility from the person who we originally started having the conversation. And so I think in order to bridge that gap, when we're having, and certainly we know when people are being abusive and disrespectful versus an honest conversation about trying to understand differences. And we have to be comfortable enough to have those conversations in a respectful way that informs and that educates, as opposed to making people more polarized. So I think that's for me, that was a big takeaway, that I want to be, if I had a question or lack of understanding about cultural differences, I should be able to ask and have an educational discussion about it without feeling attacked.
It's beautiful.
And
That's
I
true.
totally agree.
I just got an email from Karen that she has received a question from the audience.
I think it just might be a comment, but I'll read it out.
Oh, okay.
The word reparations seems to be uncomfortable to some in the room. Everybody has received reparations. The American Japanese rightfully received reparations for their 4 years of imprisonment in the internment camps. Native Americans received. My Jewish brothers and sisters rightfully received reparations that occurred in foreign land. Even the Southern slave owners received reparations after the 1877 compromise, when the federal government removed the soldiers who were protecting the Blacks who were participating in the Reconstruction. The granting of reparations for these groups did not require a study for reparations, and foundational Black Americans should not have to wait 400 years for theirs.
Yeah, although I'd say that the reparations for the Japanese Americans who were interned did come out of a commission that was established in, I think, the late 70s. So establishing a commission to have the discussion about how best to do this, I think, is not I think is a real step, not a placating.
And it's so complicated because we're talking 400 years
Right.
of oppression.
Right.
And so many different aspects of oppression, education, criminal justice, redlining, housing. I mean, again, when we talk about the structural racism that's embedded in this country and peeling that onion back, it's so layered.
Okay, so let me give out a last call for questions. Anybody else have any questions for any of our panelists? Does anybody on the panel want to have a final word?
I think a final word from everyone would be great.
Okay, would somebody like to begin with a final word?
Tammy, can you share about the Woman of Gold and how that inspired you?
I did share a little bit about Maria Altman's story in the Clint painting, but the inspiration has actually, I'm working with some Harvard students, and they're putting together legislation, and the hope is that using, and this is one thing that I think it was raised a little earlier. We all have shared experiences, but we don't have the shared legacy. And so one of the things that I hope will come out of this movement is that we can hold up as a shared legacy the protection of cultural property. There's the belief that because people of color and because of slavery that we have no cultural property, but that's not true. And in my case, particularly Harvard University, who wants to control the narrative of who my enslaved ancestors are, and their narrative is not accurate. And so, historically, this is what has always bothered people of color. Our history has never been told. And then when it is, it's not told accurately. So it's about taking back and reclaiming our history. I think if there's one thing that the Jewish community and the Black community can partner on, is talking about our shared experiences and our shared differences, and particularly how legislatively we have really not made any inroads in terms of protections for our enslaved ancestors in the history of slavery in this country.
Thank you, Tammy.
I guess I would just chime in and say, I think that there is obviously an enormous amount to do. And I think there is a lot that people on this call, people on calls like this around the country can get involved, whether they're involved in their own local communities, on, whether it's a Black Jewish dialogue group, or whether it's getting involved in a criminal justice reform effort. There are things that can be supported at the federal level. I mean, we've talked about HR 40, a number of times here. If this is something that the Jewish community in general would get behind, I think that there would be a lot going there. I'm not speaking here as I'm speaking as Bruce Turnbull, lay leader, not a JCPA position, but I think that there are a number of things that can be done that would move the process forward. And the last thing I would say is that what Tammy said about the concern that the response to the George Floyd killing fading away, I think that's something that would just be tragic if that happened again. And so we need to redouble our efforts so that does not fade away.
Correct.
Thank you. And David?
Yeah, so Bruce, as your introduction stated, used to teach a course on Black Jewish relations. And I remember looking at his deck of slides, and he had one that really stood out for me, which was something like 70% of New York City school teachers in the early 1960s were Jewish. And I don't know if that's the exact figure, but even if it's even a little off, it still tells you how different our positioning, Jewish positioning in society was then compared to now, and how much more proximate probably many Jews were in inner cities and with African Americans then than they are now. And I think our challenge is to understand that reality and to take steps that try to alleviate it, to become more proximate, to connect in real ways, to find opportunities to engage. I mean, this is the society we live in. It's not just our own neighborhood or our own suburbs. I mean, we live in a society, and there are challenges in these societies that are playing out in our national politics. And if we're so unwilling to sort of move outside of our own bubbles, then I think we're in trouble. And so that's a larger statement about, I think, our attitude about engagement should be, but it's also about, Jewish-Black relations. Let's find people to talk to and connect with and causes to get involved with. We'll learn, we'll become better, we'll make society better over time. We'll come up with new policies, we'll come up with new approaches. We'll bring others along with us over time so that we cut into that percentage of people that is sort of culturally alienated. We've got a lot of work to do, and I think there are ways to be involved, and I'm happy to help in any way I can with that. I get to work with Karen very closely, so if there's any way we can be helpful, please let us know. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and I feel very honored that I got to moderate this so I could be part of this and learn from you all. And I'm very grateful for all your contributions to this wonderful conversation. So with that, I'm going to send it back to Marcia. If she's
Thank you, Sharon.
here. Oh,
Thank
there you
you.
are.
I'm right here. So that pretty much brings our evening to a close, everyone. I hope you all learned something and were inspired by our speakers. I have a huge thank you to Tammy and David, Bruce, Sharon, and of course, Sherry, who unfortunately had to leave a little early. We will look forward to seeing you all at the next Federation-sponsored event, which will actually be next Friday at 1:45 p.m. Go to the website and you'll see all about that. And for now, everybody, just a wonderful good night. And thank you all for being here. And stay safe and stay healthy. And again, to our panelists, thank you so much. It was a
And
pleasure.
thank you, Marcia. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you all. Good night, guys.
night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Night.